Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to part 4, the final session of our webinar series on making progress in asset management. And welcome back to those who have attended our previous series. So this series is brought to you by AMO in partnership with Asset Management Ontario. My name is Erin Orr. I am a program advisor on the CSBF team at AMO, and my focus is on infrastructure and asset management. So as mentioned, this is the 4th session of the webinar series. Slides and recordings for the previous sessions are available to the public at buildingcommunities.ca and at amontario.ca. So the first session was on proposed levels of service and performance, the second on risk assessment, the third on life cycle management and financial strategy, and today's session is on growth. So this 4-part series is focused on supporting the continued progress in asset management within the context of Ontario regulatory requirements. Our main objective with this series is to enable municipalities to advance their asset management programs for effective infrastructure management and long-term financial planning. I will be providing an overview of the Canada Community Building Fund requirements as it relates to housing. But before I do so, I'm happy to send it over to Jennifer Court from Asset Management Ontario, who will be introducing the panelists and summarizing the provincial regulatory requirements for growth and asset management.
Thanks so much, Erin. Hello again. Seeing some very familiar names in the chat. I'm Jen Cord, Executive Director of Asset Management Ontario. As Erin said, this is our 4th and final session in the series. I am going to get my slides going, so bear with me. Okay, we have 3 great panelists with us today who I'm going to introduce to you in just a moment. First, I'm going to go through just some of my standard housekeeping notes. So we will have time for a Q&A at the end of the panel discussion. Please post your questions in the Q&A box as we have been using. We will read them from there. You can engage with each other in the chat. In the meantime, feel free to introduce yourselves, let us know who you are and where you're attending. But questions, please use that Q&A box. Finally, content from today's webinar will be available on our event page. Following the webinar, the presentations from Erin and I will be posted, as well as a recording of the panel discussion. I've posted a link to that in the chat, and I will do so again at the end of the session. So before I get into the rest of my slides, I do want to introduce our panelists. We have today Leanne Brannigan, the Director of Enterprise Asset Management at Peel Region, Dan Wilson, CAO of Centre Wellington, and Margaret Karpenko, the Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer from the City of North Bay. Just going to read some introductions for the panelists. And then we will get into some great discussion later. So Leanne, as I said, is the Director of Enterprise Asset Management at Peel Region with overarching responsibility for $52 billion in diverse infrastructure, ranging from water, linear, through social housing, and everything in between. Leanne was key in establishing the internal relationships necessary for rolling the program out across all of Peel's diverse services to set organizational priorities and inform evidence-based decision-making, supporting a community for life. Leanne has also leveraged her experience and passion as the founding chair of AM Ontario, past chair of CNAM, and serves as a member of FCM's MAMP Technical Working Group. Dan is the Chief Administrative Officer for the Township of Centre Wellington. He has extensive experience in the areas of municipal government and public administration with a focus on governance, policy development, organizational structure, municipal finance, budgeting, and asset management planning. In a prior consulting role, Dan assisted many municipalities with the preparation of asset management policies, strategies, and plans. He specialized in preparing financial strategies, including life cycle funding, analysis of funding sources, the calculation of funding gaps, and defining levels of service requirements. In his roles at Centre Wellington, which included Managing Director of Corporate Services and Treasurer, and now CAO, he has refined tools and approaches to council and public communication and developed strategies to assess asset management progress while promoting continuous improvement. And last but not least, Margaret Karpenko is, as I said, the Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer for the City of North Bay. She has 22 years of municipal experience, including 13 years at the City of North Bay. Margaret is a leader in change management, strategic planning, and management systems to ensure compliance and efficiency while ensuring organizational objectives are achieved. She has over 10 years of senior management experience in spearheading the integration of effective financial management, corporate governance, and business operation practices. Margaret is a senior leadership champion for asset management at the City of North Bay. She's a board member of Asset Management Ontario and has briefed the provincial government on asset management policy and program funding design. So, very excited to have our panelists here with us. Um, I'm going to go into some brief slides first, and then we'll come back to our panelists for a discussion. So, as Aaron mentioned, before we get into the discussion, we're going to set the context for the conversation by highlighting some key considerations for incorporating growth considerations into asset management planning and how the need to increase housing supply and the housing needs assessment, and talk about the housing needs assessment requirement for CCBF. So I will start by talking about asset management and growth. As we've been emphasizing over the course of the last three webinars, asset management is all about sustainable service delivery and balancing that push and pull between levels of service, risk management, life cycle strategies, and costs to drive decisions. In order to ensure that the decisions that you make are sustainable over the long term, you need to be able to anticipate and plan for growth in your municipality and how that's going to impact your asset portfolio. So, some considerations include increased demand on existing assets, changing service expectations, changing population demographics and distribution, the impacts of climate change, and of course, how to fund growth related costs. Not only is incorporating growth considerations into your asset management planning the smart thing to do, it's also required under Ontario Regulation 58817. As we have been focused throughout the series on achieving 2025 regulatory compliance, I'm going to provide a high-level overview of those 2025 requirements. However, the 2025 requirements build on the 2024 requirements. So I'm going to start there with just a quick overview, starting with the requirements for municipalities under 25,000 people. The specific language from the regulation is on the slide, but essentially you need to include assumptions and about changes to populations and economic activity and the corresponding life cycle activities and costs related to maintaining current levels of service for 10 years. For 2025 compliance, municipalities under 25,000 are again looking at the future changes in population activity that were included in the 2024 plan. But in your July 1st, 2025 plan, you need to consider how your assumptions about population and economic growth inform your 10-year life cycle management and financial strategy as they relate to those proposed levels of service that we talked about in session one. For municipalities larger than 25,000, the 2024 requirements are from the reg are on the slide. The text is a bit small, I acknowledge. Bit more detail here. Paragraphs 1 through 5 break down the requirements for very specific contexts. So different sizes, different geographic contexts. The exact requirements are slightly different for each of those specific contexts, but essentially for each, the requirement was to include a population and employment forecast. Paragraph 6 additionally requires estimated capital expenditures and significant operating costs for the life cycle activities associated with current levels of service for 10 years. So building on that, for 2025, we're looking again at those population and employment forecasts as they inform the required 10-year capital expenditures and operating costs. The changes are that you're considering the 10-year capital expenditures and operating costs as they relate to achieving your proposed levels of service for core and non-core assets, including estimated capital expenditures and significant operating costs related to new construction or to upgrading of existing municipal infrastructure assets. You also need to consider the funding projected to be available by source as a result of the increased population and economic activity, and an overview of the risks associated with implementation of the asset management plan and any actions that would be proposed in response to those risks. And with that, I will turn it back over to Erin.
All right, thank you, Jen. So I'm just going to share my screen again. All right, yeah, so a great summary of the technical details for growth under the Ontario regulation. I'm going to turn it over to housing. So growth and housing, of course, they go hand in hand. Assessing growth trends and housing pressures is a critical factor to enabling effective asset management. I'm going to focus on housing and go over some key terms that are emerging in this space. So the first is housing pressures. So housing pressures arise from many sources, either a shortage of housing available, housing costs that are too high, and or a lack of affordable housing options. These last two sound like they may be referring to the same thing, but affordable housing is actually a specific term that comes with a math equation. So it refers to housing that costs less than 30% of the before-tax household income in the area. So now when discussing housing pressures as it relates to municipal responsibilities, our focus is primarily on infrastructure gaps that may be contributing to the housing pressures. So these infrastructure gaps can be from many places. It could be from missing assets, which are creating a roadblock for new connections or neighborhoods being built. It could be a system-wide capacity shortage with your services, or it could be funding concerns, whether that is short or long-term funding. This last one is quite significant because over time we have discovered that growth does not, in fact, pay for growth in all circumstances, as previously believed. So this brings us to the term housing enabling infrastructure. This is the infrastructure that directly or indirectly allows for the construction of more housing units. So I have some examples there. The first is the transportation network. So your network of roads, bridges, and sidewalks. This all enables access and connectivity. It could also include your public transit system. Housing enabling infrastructure can also refer to the capacity of your water distribution systems and the treatment plants as well. It could refer to distribution of electricity, and frankly, it can refer to any other asset that increases the capacity of the community to build more housing and supports a growing population. This means that it could even include things like expanding your community centers or expanding access to public parks and trails. Now, as for municipal compliance, I'm going to briefly go over the Canada Community Building Fund and the requirements that are defined under the new agreements. So the CCBF, formerly called the Gas Tax Fund, is permanent, predictable, and upfront funding for Ontario municipalities. It is used for priority infrastructure. Now, to identify your priorities, asset management and housing needs assessments are really great tools. So in the first session, if you attended the first session of this series, I mentioned that asset management progress is a requirement under the CCBF agreements, but another priority is housing supply. So the agreement includes a principle to commit to improve the housing supply and affordability of housing in Ontario. And to accomplish this goal, the federal government has asked municipalities to use CCBF money for infrastructure projects that increase the housing supply wherever it makes sense to do so. This means focusing your funding on projects that enable or preserve housing in your community. Another requirement under the agreement coming from the federal government is a housing needs assessment document. These documents are called H&As. So H&As are actually required for all federal funding. Under the CCBF, it is only required for single tier and lower tier municipalities with a population of 30,000 or more. But these H&As identify, they identify growth projections, core housing needs, and your infrastructure gaps as well. This is all really important information for effective long-term infrastructure planning. So we understand that these new priorities surrounding housing can seem like a lot to consider, especially when we're only just getting used to asset management as an infrastructure planning tool. But one of the best ways to plan for housing enabling infrastructure is through your asset management practices. So I'm really looking forward to our panel today to open up the discussion of integrating growth and housing considerations into asset management planning. I'm going to send it back to Jen, who will be launching our panel discussion.
All right, thanks, Erin. So right now I'd like to welcome our panelists to come back on camera and we are going to get into our discussion. So I will post the sort of guiding questions in the chat in just a moment. But to get started, I'd like to invite our panelists to answer the following question. How do you integrate growth into long-term planning? How does it appear in your asset management plans and programs specifically? How are you thinking? How are you thinking about growth? Leanne, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. I want to start off by giving a little bit of an overview about there's a whole bunch of ways and factors that you can integrate growth into your asset management program. And that could depend on the size of your organization, your municipal structure, your organizational structure, your organizational division of duties and responsibilities, your asset management strategy, and your long-term financial planning strategy. These will all affect how you make decisions and integrate factors such as growth. As a large regional municipality, we've made choices that align decisions with the areas that are most optimal to support the decision making that we make it as an organization. TCA, DC's, growth, and planning all fall outside of asset management appeal, but that doesn't mean we're not integrated with them from a decision making standpoint. Our asset management program governs decisions and recommendations around our existing infrastructure and is embedded within the long-term financial planning strategy, as well as our council objective and proposed levels of service that we've had for many years that predated any regulatory requirements. We've got a full integration of our state of good repair and asset performance related standards in our asset management plans, strategies, and processes, consistent annual reviews to ensure that all of those levels of service and risks are continuing to meet the ever increasing service needs to do with growth as well as the changing service environments. But growth is not included directly into our asset management reporting, especially from an initial install standpoint. That's separate and falls under another area at our organization that deals with those growth factors. However, in our 10 and 20-year plans, we do include those subsequent replacements. And a good example is your vehicles. So you have a 7-year vehicle. We don't want to not, and we're buying it in year 1. We don't want to not have it in year 8 of our plan because we'd be underestimating both our tax and reserve and rate requirements ongoing. So we do have those subsequent replacements in our 10 and 20-year plans. We also provide and embed our growth plans. So we get the growth plan from our planning area, and we integrate that so that when we're doing our 40 and 100-year pictures to ensure we're putting reserves away appropriately, we have those subsequent replacements of that infrastructure in those plans as well. This all supports our service-based budgeting because that's how we go forward with our budgets, is all in a service base, which is reflective of our placement of our current the placement in our long-term financial planning strategy and our current infrastructure. Initial growth is financed and administered separately at Peel, and asset management does support some scenario-based modeling to support growth decision-making and options analysis, but we don't embed it directly into our plans except for that longer-term planning, rate setting, and reserve contributions. That's kind of where we sit. And that's kind of different as with the division of duties between us and our locals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think good integration and obviously a bit of a different context since you've got since you know your upper tier and you're working with your lower tiers. So let's go to one of our other panelists now and hear about a different context. Dan, do you want to take it away?
Sounds good. Thank you. Just some context. Center Wellington's municipality, lower tier in Wellington County, population just over 30,000 people, growing to 58,000 people by 2051 at a minimum. So high growth, and growth plays a huge role in pretty much everything we do at the township. And obviously we have to integrate growth into asset management planning because as Aaron mentioned, growth doesn't necessarily pay for growth. So there are rates and fees implications to growth within the township, and we need to make sure our budgets and our asset management plans account for that. So we, at a high level, as I said, growth impacts everything we do at the township because we are growing so fast and we're considered a medium-sized, small to medium-sized municipality in the province. What we try to do is make sure that our growth planning and our growth communication to the public is consistent. And to do that, we have our longer term planning documents like our master plans that we do every 10 years. They feed into asset management plans, which we have to do a minimum every 5 years, which feeds into a budget process that we do annually. So we make sure that cycle of information stays consistent between master plans and things we do every 5 years, like a DC study we do every 5 to 10 years. And we need to make sure that they're all consistent in telling the same story. So it's critical for us to make sure that those are all integrated. Obviously, the most up-to-date information is the information we're updating annually through the budget process. But we need to do this. This is an important tool for us, the asset management plan, in showing the province how much we're growing. And we use that as a tool to apply for grant funding and justify our CCBF funding, for example. So that is critical for us at the township. And my only other comment is when we're doing long-term planning, whether it's in our budget process, which includes a 10-year capital forecast, or any other long-term planning, we can't just look at inflationary impacts. We have to look at growth impacts as well. We are constantly looking at the need for new facilities, new roads, new water, wastewater systems, and that is something that impacts us on an annual basis, and we need to make sure that we plan for that accordingly.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, some very strong messages there about that consistency and integration. Obviously, very, very fast growing municipalities. So interesting to hear about those priorities. Thank you. So Margaret, coming to us from the north, I'm sure you've got a bit of a different perspective and a different context in which you're thinking about growth. Can you speak a little bit about how you're integrating growth into long-term planning? You're currently on mute.
Sure. So a little bit like Dan, we are a single-tier municipality with a population of 50,000. So where Dan is heading towards. Our difference is that we're not in a period of rapid growth. We haven't experienced rapid growth to this point. We've been the slow and steady turtle type approach in our growth and development. So we've been a little bit lucky in being able to adequately plan and ensure that all of our water and wastewater systems and our road network is keeping up and being oversized appropriately for that slow and steady growth. I think in terms of our long-term planning, like the others, we're integrating it with all of our other master plans. And this year's goal to align with the requirements of asset management, we're redesigning our long-term funding plan and our long-term approach. So we've had a long-term funding plan and a long-term strategy for the last 20 years that has pretty much remained unchanged. And I really think the planning and requirements through asset management is driving us to rethink that model and maybe fund things in a different way. One of our primary goals that we're very strategic on is ensuring optimization of all of the grants and third-party funding. Has been said, growth doesn't pay for growth. So we try to offset that with very aggressive application-based funding, as well as ensuring that every dollar from CCBF, OCIF, are strategically used to ensure the rehabilitation and renewal as well as new investment in our assets. So some recent examples, City of North Bay has just over a 10-year new water treatment plant. So we have a state-of-the-art facility that is already put us in a position that we're ready for growth for the long term for the next 30, 40 years. As well, we're in the midst of building a new double pad, state-of-the-art, environmentally friendly standard community center and ice pad. So those are some really big investments that help our community grow and make us attractive, but have not been. The new arena coming on board was a state of replacement and rehabilitation of our assets for an old single pad arena. So you can see how growth ties into that longer term planning. We're replacing a single pad with a double pad to help that community growth in the longer term.
Excellent. Thanks, Margaret. So I think some similarities there in that approach to using that asset management informed approach to getting more access to that external funding. I'm going to move on to our second question now for the panel. So have you identified infrastructure gaps that are causing barriers to support housing? For example, water or wastewater system capacity, transportation network connectivity, power distribution, etc. Who wants to start us off?
I can start us off this time.
Thanks, Margaret.
So for us, like I said, we're that slow, steady growth. What we find some of our barriers are the developers ready to engage their lands. We have very little lands owned by the municipality. Topography is definitely a challenge to supporting housing and growth. We either have rock or swamp, and then we also have a very steep escarpment. As you know, we have a ski hill in the middle of our city, so you can imagine the height of our escarpment in North Bay. So with those challenges, we have been focusing on our housing and expansion in terms of intensification and building internally. However, we do have in our asset management plan and in our capital plan some critical assets such as lift stations and pumping stations to push that water up the hill to open up some land masses into the upcoming years in order to meet our housing targets. So again, informed decisions, we've known about the required investments and planning towards that very strategically to ensure it's affordable to all the current citizens. But now is the time to open those up with the housing mandates.
Excellent. Thanks, Margaret. Yeah, perhaps some common, perhaps some different challenges due to your geographic location. Dan, do you want to respond?
Sounds good, thank you. My mayor's favorite comment is when he's asked, what do we need because of growth? He says everything. So I'm going to narrow it down a little bit more than everything. And our main capacity issue really is water for us. We have 7 wells in Center Wellington, and we have a water master plan that says we're planning out for 4 new wells. So it's very significant for us, and wastewater isn't an issue right now, but with growth, it will likely become an issue in 10 years. So we have to plan out for wastewater treatment plant expansions through our DC study to accommodate growth beyond 10 years. Beyond water and wastewater, the top 2 I would say is traffic. If you've been to Center Wellington, we have a lot of streams and rivers. We have the Grand River going right through Fergus and Elora, and it impedes traffic because we have very limited bridges and structures that can go across the river. So we have a transportation plan that says we need more collector roads to bring traffic around town. We need some more bridges, and that is very expensive. And we have 111 bridges currently in Center Wellington, which I bet is the most bridges per capita anywhere in Canada. So that becomes a very expensive undertaking. And the last item near and dear to our council's heart is actually Parks and Recreation. We're growing so fast, and we can't forget about those types of services, promoting the health and wellness of our citizens. We need more parks, we need more recreation facilities across the board. And I would say that's our council's #1 priority is Parks and Recreation. We almost have to remind them don't forget about roads, water, and wastewater. We need that too, because they really like to talk about Parks and Rec.
Love to hear that. I think, Aaron mentioned, housing enabling infrastructure. We talk about some of those core assets, but the, quality of life, those facilities that, attract people to your community are really worth thinking about as well. Thank you very much. And Leanne.
Yes, some of my challenges I would think that are because of the size of our organization. And once again, both our municipal structure and the challenges that come along with that. With division of infrastructure responsibilities from an upper tier to our locals. And the transition of planning down to the locals and the challenge that this raises in ensuring that there's planning coordination. We have sufficient capacity in our water and wastewater plants to meet the needs of growth. The challenges come that it's not nimble in aligning or changing a network to, I don't want to say the whims, but the changes that will happen in where they would like growth to happen at our locals basis. An example would be there was a request to put significant growth in their downtown core when there was not sufficient capacity there, and that was not planned for a number of years into the future. So a lot of that is around how do you align those plans and make sure that they're aligned long term. We have had a lot of alignment, but it's those all of a sudden we want to change that doesn't fit with a significantly large network that takes time. If anybody's dealt with contractors lately, you're not going to change capacity of your pipes into a downtown core in a very short period of time. A lot of the risks that are around that is around the responsibilities and alignment of those master plans, housing growth plans, and the download of planning services are causing. So it's less on the infrastructure side than on the coordination side when you're dealing with different tiers and significantly large networks, and some lack of clarity in the downloading of planning that's causing some interim wrinkles that I know that we're going to sort out because but we're working on that. So it's less the infrastructure gaps than it is the coordination and ensuring that we're doing the same thing in the same places.
And you've certainly faced some uncertainties in recent times as well.
A little bit,
So
yes.
fair. All right, I am going to move us along to our third question. And so I'm just wondering, are there any other roadblocks to supporting growth, such as funding strategies or land availability that are affecting you in your particular region? Dan, do you want to take it away?
I'll start on this one, thanks. I have 3 areas that I would call roadblocks in Center Wellington. The first one is funding. We are, like I said, we're growing really fast. Growth doesn't pay for growth. So there are pressures on our existing taxpayers, our existing user fee payers. And to be honest, we need the existing funding such as CCBF and OCIF to really pay for non-growth related costs. So we really are struggling with how to pay for costs that we can't use DCs for. And I know there's a huge target on development charges right now, both on the provincial side and with developers. And I would just be concerned if development charges were restricted or disappeared, because without an alternate source of funding, it would really have a huge impact on growth in municipalities like Center Wellington. Second item is land. With our fast growing pace here in Center Wellington, we don't have enough land in the urban boundary to accommodate it. So we're currently going through a settlement area boundary expansion with Wellington County to expand our urban boundary to accommodate that growth. So that's a fairly extensive process that takes a lot of time and effort on our staff. And to that point, I would say our third roadblock is actually staff capacity. When you're a smaller township and you're growing really quickly, you get a lot of interest from other developers. Like we're not a municipality that has 2 or 3 developers in town. We have 20 developers in town looking to build, a lot of them from the GTA because of restrictions in the GTA. You jump over the green belt, you land in Center Wellington. So they've all found where we are. And to be honest, our staff are spending so much time corresponding with developers. Some of them are actually initiating their own urban boundary expansions right now, which is taking a lot of time. So when you have a small planning staff, you're not approving development applications if you're spending so much time with urban boundary expansions and OLT appeals and so forth. So staff capacity plays a huge role for us, and we can't hire staff fast enough to take on this growth.
Mm. Thanks for that, Dan. I think, yeah, a very clear breakdown on those challenges, and certainly, yeah, I think some common refrains that we've heard from in conversations with other municipalities as well. Leanne, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I was just ready for it. I think a lot of it is around unknowns and uncertainty. And I think there's a lot of challenges that are there. I mean, there's our political environment, and I'm talking big politics that are giving us that uncertainty, international, federal, provincial, and then small politics that are affecting local areas, and that could, and specifically a lot that's affecting our organization from a lot of uncertainty. And they do, as Dan indicated, impact capacity from and staff capacity from a lot of perspectives. I think the other challenges and roadblocks, like I was mentioning a little bit earlier, is alignment and coordination. And that can be with an upper tier and a local, or it can be with all of those other services that are required that we don't necessarily control when you're looking at utilities and the like. There's those big things, inflation and tariffs, that are affecting our financing. You're funding projects and you're finding a year later, because sometimes by the time you're getting to your EAs and planning and procurement, years down the road, that you can only pay for about half of the project that you originally were approved for. So these things are affecting current financing as well as your projections into the future. And then there's the funding pressures and uncertainty just around where's the money coming from, how are we going to be structured, where that are hitting everyone, large or small. Because of the significant pressures that are on our public. How are we increasing our rates and taxes to meet the needs that we've identified that they have? So how are we ensuring that we're putting the right stuff in place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Leanne. Tariffs, I've tried to mute all my alerts, just pop-ups coming in as we speak on new tariffs. So really highlights the accelerating uncertainties and the difficulties of doing those longer term projections. So Margaret, did you want to add on to that and share some of your roadblocks and challenges?
I think our discussion really shows from large to small, our roadblocks are very similar. Like I don't have anything new to add to what Leanne and Dan spoke about. Challenges about funding, and I talked about how we're trying to deal with that is through aggressively applying for grants. However, that poses its own challenges, right? Because we never put shovels in the ground or go to procurement until all your funding applications and your financing is in order. So until you have a full plan, you can't activate. When you can't activate, you're not moving fast enough to keep up with the change and the demands that are out there as on municipalities. There's some external forces that just think we can snap our fingers and say, "Well, expand to the north. It's very easy." And you can go planning thinking you're expanding to the north, and then all of a sudden the landowner to the south pulls the trigger and you're expanding to the south. And so there's a lot of uncertainty and reactionary where you're trying through asset management and through long-term financial planning to look forward and plan forward, but then all of a sudden you're reacting and moving a totally different plan way and adjusting to everything. And it is all of that core infrastructure that CCBF supports, as well as OCIF, in terms of building the community, in terms of roads, water, bridges. But then it's all those ancillary assets that build communities, such as arenas, parks and playgrounds and trails, and naturalized areas that still come with a cost to the overall taxpayer. And really, those are the areas that put significant tax burden on the local residents and the current historical residents even before growth. So the whole notion, I don't think it's been said enough today. Growth doesn't play for growth, and I think that's been a common theme for us all. In terms of capacity, up in the north, we also have staffing capacity, some hiring challenges, but our capacity also extends to our construction network and who we put out for proposals. We have a very small, limited construction network and folks that are successful in our tenders. We're only starting to see the creep from the south coming and actively bidding on our proposals and our tenders that are out there. So I don't know if this trend is temporary or here to stay or is going to create. Definitely welcomed in terms of creating that additional capacity. We have over a $90 million annual capital investment and capital plan. And a lot of our roadblocks is that we can't activate it all because we don't have the resources to pull off that level of construction on an annual basis. So our plans could be great, but then if you don't have those resourcing in terms of internal staff and as well as the construction companies out there to actively bid and fulfill your requirements, those are definitely roadblocks to growth moving forward.
Mhm. Excellent. Thank you, Margaret. Yeah, it definitely sounds like some commonalities we're hearing throughout, and then just some local nuances. So with that, seeing a lot of questions coming into the Q&A, so I'm going to take us to the Q&A portion. I'm going to start with a question that's a good sort of progression from what we've just been talking about. I think you've all spoken to this a little bit already. Question is, one of the big challenges we face in planning for growth is the uncertainty on timing. We often don't know when and where growth will occur on an annual basis as required for asset management planning. Have you encountered this challenge and how do you address it? So, as I said, I think several of you sort of touched on this challenge in your responses to the last question. But yeah, anything you'd like to add to expand in a response to that question? Margaret, want to start things off?
Sure. So in our municipality, the developer takes over the whole subdivision or area until it's grown. So because they're responsible for putting in the roads and sewers and street lights and starting up, it's not until we sign it over and the city takes ownership of that road. So I find that there's plenty of time to plan those new subdivisions that pop up unexpectedly, as long as your connecting sewer mains and stuff are sized properly to feed into that network. There's definitely a lot of time to plan on when that subdivision is going to be turned back over to the city and to integrate those into our asset management plan, knowing the age and the structure and the size and the build. Then you can easily plan it into the future for your rehabilitation and replacement cycles. So that's how we deal with that.
Mm-hmm. Being surprised and then planning for it as you see the subdivisions unfolding. Dan, do you want to elaborate?
Yes, thank you. For us, this is, I would say, more of an art than a science because growth plans constantly change here in the township. So what we do is we have an estimated timing maybe in our asset management plan, but in our DC study. But then when we do our annual budgets, it's changing all over the place because some developers accelerate, some defer, and you really don't know what's going on unless you look at your budget from a year-to-year basis. So what we try to do is communicate to our developers and say, if you want to move forward in your development, the township is expecting to enter into a service financing agreement with you where you may be upfronting development charges to pay for some of the township related infrastructure costs around that. And that makes it easier for us. We don't have to allocate other funding to that. We just have to manage our DC cash flow in terms of being able to receive those DC funds early and use them to accommodate growth in a certain development. So it seems to change on an annual basis, and it's impossible to keep your DC study and your asset management plan completely up to date unless you're doing those annually. but it's the budget process we use to make those tweaks as things go on.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, just gotta be nimble, right? Leanne, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I don't really have anything to add to that because our asset management team doesn't directly do our growth, the growth plans. We have a separate group that deals with our DCs and growth. So I think that Dan and Margaret have answered it better than I could. Thanks.
Fair enough. Okay, I'm gonna pop around in our Q&A. I'm gonna move on to a question from Sal Zafar. Have you quantified the impact of growth on life cycle activities over the next 10 years in your recent or upcoming asset management plan? Dan, start us off.
We did that in our last asset management plan, and we're working on our 2025 asset management plan now that will go to council in a few months. It's something we're trying to become more efficient at, but we are doing it. So we have, for example, we know when growth's happening more or less on an annual basis. We have an idea of what that does in terms of assuming assets from a developer, making sure that they're in the calculation for life cycle replacement, making sure that we have the necessary operating funds for the ongoing operation and maintenance of those assets. And then through various optimization strategies, when do we plan to repair or remediate that asset? So it's again an art rather than a science for us right now, because we don't have software that will currently do that calculation for us, but we're doing it for the larger assets such as road, water, wastewater facility assets. For something like vehicles, what we typically do is a new vehicle comes into our program through the capital budget, and then once it's acquired, it goes through an operating procedure and is added to our life cycle needs for future replacement based on useful life. So it's an art, but we are doing it, yes.
Thanks, Dan. Leanne?
Yeah, Sal's going to love this answer. Yes and no. So we don't directly quantify and distinguish growth as the impact for differential on our life cycle activities. However, we do integrate. We actually issue our asset management, our enterprise asset management plan annually, and we do identify variances from previous. And a lot of times that is because we've added new infrastructure, we've added things to it based on growth. But we don't distinguish that as a unique characteristic or manage it as an ongoing impact, because we hopefully had it embedded as a projected growth impact last year in our previous plans. So it's a weird yes and no. We already have them integrated. And we also do evaluate levels of service and risk every year to see if there is a growth impact that's affecting services, so that we can adjust and accordingly to make sure that we're meeting our service delivery needs.
Excellent. Thanks, Leanne.
So North Bay's plan to date, the 24 plan did not have any growth projections in it, other than some real nominal growth in terms of forecasted assumed assets from subdivisions or the lift stations and pumping stations to open up the lands that I had mentioned earlier up the state. But short of those, we really didn't embed growth into our last plan, and it's going to be more deliberate in our upcoming update. But like I said, our growth is not as impactful as some in the south thus far. Not like it could change, but thus far our growth impact has been slow and steady, and so it hasn't been included to this point.
Got it. Thanks, Margaret. Okay, I know that there's one question that Dan did answer already in the chat. I'm just gonna touch on Howard Tong asks, can you elaborate on the point of why growth does not pay for growth effectively? Comment and Aaron, I know this came up in your presentation as well, so feel free to chime in. So Dan's response, in short, legislation for DCs and CBCs don't allow municipalities to fund all growth-related costs from DCs and CBCs. This puts some of the growth costs on taxpayers and other user fees such as water and wastewater. Just wanted to give other panelists an opportunity to sort of weigh in on other challenges they may be facing around sort of how growth is not currently funding growth in all cases. Leanne, do you want to start things off?
Okay, go
Sorry,
ahead,
Margaret.
Well, no, I was going to say, I know why Howard's asking this question because Howard's on my team. And it is embedded in our long-term financial planning strategy that we do have growth pay for growth, but we are doing this through loans and ensuring that we achieve the financing so that we're getting loans that the developers then are paying back, the DCs are paying back, so we do still have growth paying for growth as part of our long-term financial planning strategies, even though the mechanisms do not exist currently to support that happening everywhere. So just giving a little bit of context there and answering it on behalf of our organization.
Thanks, Leanne. Margaret, go ahead.
So growth doesn't pay for growth. Here in North Bay, we've had development charges since its inception. However, we are surrounded by several small municipalities that do not have development charges. And so our development community is very influential and has convinced the political realms to be in the decision makers that development charges are an extra tax and should not be charged. And so, although we've been able to retain our development charge bylaw this far, our development charge rates have never been at the maximum allowable rate as calculated. So, even though the calculation inherently doesn't have growth pay for growth because of the discounts, the further politicization and the strength, and you hear it in Toronto, like the development community is very vocal and very influential to the process. And they've won some messaging in that case. And so our development charge are only approved at maybe 50% of the maximum allowable amount. And that is now been 10 years. We're going on the 10th year before we renew it. So we have to renew and update our bylaw, and I'm hoping we could keep something because it's better than nothing in terms of funding and supporting the growth. But we've had some real challenges in keeping our bylaw alive.
Yeah, I'm very...
Sorry, I'm going to jump in here just real quick, just on the concept of funding, of course, coming from the CCBF team. You guys have already talked about the time and effort that you're taking to also apply for grants to pay for growth as well. And we know that takes a lot of effort, that takes staff time as well. So CCBF eligibility does go beyond roads and bridges, though we know it's been a long standard to use for your transportation networks, and it's a fantastic tool for that. But there are other eligibilities, and those include feasibility studies. As Margaret mentioned, some studies may be required in order to allow development and development opportunities. Those are actually eligible under CCBF. Other things are a portion of staff costs. So there's a lot of different opportunities under CCBF to further help with growth and housing opportunities as well.
Thanks a lot, Erin. Yeah, good to keep in mind. Okay, so we do need to wrap up. We have a number of other questions in the Q&A. I'm sorry we can't get to them all. We have a big question from Cassandra Pacey, and we don't have a lot of time left. What I'm going to do is invite each panelist to just give me their sort of like top rapid fire response before we turn it back over to me for my wrap up. So Cassandra's asking, do you have any suggestions on how we can work together and advocate for a new funding methodology for municipalities? Property taxes are regressive, and since we own 60% of the assets, that model isn't helping us with our funding gaps. So, as I say, big question, bullet point answers. What are your top ideas here, panelists? Somebody want to dive in? Dan? I thought you might.
Short answer, conversations with your MPP, delegations at conferences like AMO and Roma. Whatever we can do to get the message out that we need a consistent funding that can assist municipalities with life cycle costing and growth funding. So I think it's the more of us do it, the greater voice that we have.
Absolutely. Leanne.
I think Dan hit on most of what I was going to say. The only other one I would say is supporting AM Ontario in their push to go forward with the ministry and get support. And that's the other
Thanks,
one.
Leanne.
That's the only other one I had.
And Margaret.
I'm out of ideas. They took all of mine.
Perfect.
I'm sure something will happen after we hang up, but for now I have nothing.
No problem. And I know this is a priority for AMO as well. So I think, yeah, broader support. I think that idea of working together is key. So apologies to those of you who asked questions that we cannot get to. Thank you so much for our panelists. I think great discussion. Before we leave, I do have one more item to share. So we talked about this in the very first session. We teased it a little bit, and I'm going to come back to it now. So we, as a sort of companion to this webinar series, have developed a new resource, a new simplified levels of service toolkit. So obviously, levels of service can be a real cornerstone of your asset management, decision-making, and planning process. The focus of this toolkit is to aid municipalities in developing proposed technical levels of service measures and targets. So this toolkit has been developed in particular to support smaller municipalities and those that are earlier in their asset management journey. It will support users in identifying and documenting current and proposed levels of service and performance targets, including condition asset levels of service, performance asset levels of service, and operating maintenance levels of service in compliance with Ontario's asset management regulation. So this toolkit is a complement to our more detailed class-specific levels of service toolkits, which are available upon request. Because facilities are particularly complex, we've developed a separate version of the kit for those. Use is the same, just specific criteria for facilities. And we have developed a user manual that includes detailed instructions about how to use the toolkit. These resources have been posted to the webinar page. You'll see them at the top of the page. So the user manual, the general or generic levels of service toolkit that includes all of your sort of core and common asset classes, as well as the facilities toolkit. So if you're interested in learning more about that, please feel free to reach out. And so with that, I want to just thank everybody again for being with us. I know a lot of you participated in the entire series. Thanks for coming. Thank you again to our panelists, and I'll thank all of the speakers that we've had throughout the series. And so as you can see on screen, contact information for AMO and for AM Ontario, please feel free to reach out, keep the conversation going. Love to talk about asset management. So with that, we will wrap up our series. Thank you to AMO for partnering with us on this. And yeah, we'll wrap it up there. Everyone enjoy the rest of your day.